Living History in My Favourite Graveyard by Beth Ruyungu. Few tourists find this fascinating glimpse of life in Copenhagen. A word for those of you listening on the podcast apps. This story comes with many photographs. Be sure to check out the Substack to see them. Link is in the show notes. I'm back in Copenhagen, a city of varied and famous walking opportunities. One of my favourites is a hidden gem close to where I stay when I'm here. Vesterkirkegård, which translates to Western Churchyard, is the largest cemetery in Denmark, several city blocks long and a couple wide. It was established in 1870, relatively recently in Danish history, on land outside the city that had little value. Immediately to the north was the prison, and the Carlsberg brewery with its piles of discarded hops, and to the south was Solhavn, a long-time dumping ground. In its early days, only the very poor were buried in the new graveyard. The cemeteries in the city were filling up, but no one who could afford to choose wanted to be buried so far from their familiar neighbourhoods. The distance was intentional as a matter of public health, at a time when epidemics of diseases like smallpox and cholera resulted in huge numbers of corpses that needed to be disposed of safely to avoid cross-contamination. Over the years, Copenhagen expanded, and as rural Danes moved into the new apartment blocks of working-class Vesterbro, nearby Vesterkirkegård provided some welcome green space. The churchyard is dotted with a lovely variety of rare and ornamental trees, and birds sing from thickets of native shrubs. Burial sections are divided by tidy beech hedges and linked by graceful tree-lined thoroughfares. One of the longest, and my favourite, is a wide path of elderly beeches. Limbs that have been removed and fallen off have left large round holes that look like eyes, and in a certain light the trees look like a line of petrified creatures with contorted arms. It's my alley of the trolls. There are always people around in the churchyard. Commuters cycling through and people spending time. Families and workers tend to graves while joggers and dog walkers stretch their legs. Young parents push infants tucked into prams and guide toddlers as they practice riding their bikes. In summer, students gather with their books, and couples bring picnic baskets and lie on the grass to drink glasses of wine. Autumn brings beautiful colours, and there are conkers, horse chestnuts, to collect, and brombær, brambles or blackberries to pick. The graveyard is part of community life. The southwest corner is defined by the rail line leading into central Copenhagen and a busy main road. It's overlooked by apartment blocks and a high school. This section of the cemetery, closest to the outskirts of town, is where the German dead from World War II are buried. There are rows upon rows of granite headstones, both sides marked with names and dates. These are mass graves, and the markers at the entrance to each plot provide a morbid arithmetic. Here lie 438 refugees and 4 German soldiers. Here lie 887 refugees and 2 German soldiers. Here, 4,019 refugees rest with 4,636 German soldiers. All told, an estimated 10,000 Germans are buried here, more than 6,000 of them Flüchtlinge, refugees. Many of these people arrived late in the war, fleeing the Russians, the destruction of the Allied forces advancing through Europe, and starvation. Some were expelled by the Nazis so that Germany would have fewer mouths to feed. Many of the dead are memorialized only as unknown. Many of the carved dates indicate babies and young children. Each time I pass by, one or two of the graves have fresh wreaths, perhaps from the descendants of those who stayed. The scale of this war memorial remains intimate somehow, its immediacy deeply moving. The cemetery also has some of the British war dead, including 19 prisoners of war from World War I who died on their way home of influenza. But most of the British troops are interred in cemeteries elsewhere in the city. Other groups with dedicated sectors include the Salvation Army and people from the Danish protectorates of Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The Jewish and Catholic cemeteries are on the edge that borders the historic Carlsberg district to the north. The Muslim section lies next to the German, that long unfavoured location, and I find it poignant because so many of the Muslim dead also arrived in Denmark as refugees, fleeing their homes to escape the horrors of war. Closer to the centre of the cemetery lie the graves of honour. Plots here are granted by Copenhagen's Kommune, the city council, to politicians, scientists and artists of note. Thorvald Stauning, 1873 to 1942, the first Social Democrat Prime Minister who led Denmark through the early years of World War II, is buried here. Also, Anker Jørgensen, 1922 to 2016, a local boy orphaned by tuberculosis who served in the Danish resistance before rising through the trade union movement to become Prime Minister. He refused to move to the official residency of the office and remained at his apartment in Solhavn, a working-class neighbourhood near the cemetery. The graves of honour lie on a shady hill overlooking a small lake, and, although there are also Conservative politicians buried here, they're outnumbered by the leftists, and the lake is nicknamed the Red Sea. The more common graves of the rest of the cemetery are beautifully arranged. There are rooms of columbariums with evergreen walls. A sculpture of a mother overlooks a lawn paved with markers commemorating children, and terraces of graves surround an ornamental pond filled with water lilies. Many of the graves are miniature gardens, the individual plot defined by a tiny hedge and lined with gravel and perennial plantings. The headstone is often a simple, unpolished boulder, etched with a name and dates, and space below for a spouse. Loved ones add solar-powered candles, seasonal decorations and flowers. Tulips are popular, colourful and robust. In the cool damp of Denmark, they don't need a vase and can be woven into the patterns of different coloured evergreens that blanket the graves in winter. Watering cans are supplied at taps around the cemetery, and sometimes the plot includes a little bench for rest and reflection. The feeling is both personal and communal somehow. There's a sense of neighbourliness. Near the ornamental pond, the final resting place of a Hell's Angel lies among graves decorated with loving family photos and children's artwork. Vestekirkegård celebrated its 150th birthday with plans to deepen its place in community life. New traditions include memorial events during All Souls at the beginning of November. A therapy garden for meditative walking has been installed, with a small room for group meetings. The performing and visual arts are everywhere in Copenhagen. One of the churchyard chapels has been used as a small theatre for several years. Before closing for renovation recently, it hosted a production of Solhavn brænder. Solhavn is burning, where local residents of different ages and backgrounds wrote and performed pieces that represented their experiences of living in the area. In late January, when the Christmas and New Year's festivities have given way to the long dark nights, the churchyard comes alive with art installations created with light. Evening visitors are treated to hot chocolate and glögg and guided walks around the exhibits. One of the famous artists buried here is the author Tove Ditlevsen. The brilliant compilation and English translation of her memoirs, Copenhagen Trilogy, is a New York Times 100 Best Books of the 21st Century. Tove, 1917 to 1976, grew up in nearby Vesterbro and later moved to Musikbyen, Music Town, an area of post-war apartment blocks in Solhavn on streets named for classical composers. Having spent much of her life in this quarter of the city, I suspected that Tove was buried here, but her grave isn't grand or remarkable, and it took me some time to locate it. Tove wrote a beloved column as an agony aunt in addition to her poetry, novels and short stories. At a time when female writers were overlooked or dismissed by the literary establishment, Tove's work became immensely popular. When she died, thousands of mourners filled the streets to follow her funeral cortege. Tove died from an overdose of sleeping pills when suicide was highly stigmatized as sinful, and I wonder if that's why she's not included in the graves of honor. A stark contrast to the humble Ditlevsen grave marker is the huge mausoleum of Gerda Elda Jørgensen, 1921 to 2010. Completed in 2014, the mausoleum stands 3.5 meters tall and took 4 years and 1.5 million krona, more than $200,000, to build. Yet no one at the unveiling knew Frau Jørgensen, and very few people have any idea of who she was. Born to a poor family, Frau Jørgensen lived at home and never married or had children. When her mother died in 1963, she drew up her will with plans for the mausoleum and moved to a small apartment in Vesterbro, where she lived a life of near anonymity. Neighbours reported that she was always tidily dressed, kept herself to herself and had no visitors. She was fiercely frugal, watching television with the lights off to save electricity. When Frau Jørgensen moved out after 22 years, she said no goodbyes and kept in touch with no one. The only impression she seems to have made is her dislike of the smell of food cooking, complaints she took to court and lost 3 times. Frau Jørgensen's will provided design specifics for the pale stone mausoleum. The towering edifice includes a vestibule for contemplation and the grave markers of her parents, an uncle, and her 2 brothers, one of whom died at 13 years and the other at a month. The money from the mausoleum seems to have been saved from Frau Jørgensen's salary as an office manager. In her will, she also set aside money for 40 years of upkeep and stipulated that any remaining money be donated to a Danish charity for the blind, which came as a pleasant surprise, no one there having previously heard of her either. Across the top of the monument is inscribed, Memento Mori, Carpe Diem. Remember you will die and seize the day. Words to live by indeed. If you'd like to visit Vestekirkegård, there are directions on how to get there in the text of this post on Substack. While you're there, why not sign up to become a subscriber and show your support? Receive a weekly story that's short enough to fit your schedule, yet long enough for you to escape. Become a free or paid subscriber today and never miss a story.